Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. So, in case you didn't catch that, the lesson for today from Jesus is this: I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth. Here ends my sermon. You all have a good day. No, I'm sorry. That's a pretty shocking statement, right? You do just get the spectacle of this story. What in the world is Jesus saying here? I mean, is this for real? A lot of readers have been left scratching their heads on this one over the years. In fact, many commentators and scholars think this is one of the most difficult passages in the New Testament to interpret. So what do we make of it? Well, first of all, the parables of Jesus always have a surprise component to them. If you hear one and fail to see some element of shock or irony, you're probably reading it wrong. But I think this is a great parable for a series on picturing grace in our common life and in our society, because Jesus is really taking some key objections head on in regards to grace. And what do I mean by grace? Generosity, benevolence, mercy, and kindness are a start. Often we see grace as the compassionate thing, the loving thing. It's something we come to based on values, but it can sometimes appear in the process to violate principles. After all, to show grace to someone who owes debt sets a bad precedent. What will people learn from that? Will others know they can get off without paying the full amount? I mean, you need to hold the line, don't you? Need to hold true to your principles. Some of you might recall the objection to bailing out banks during the financial crisis back in 2008. More recently, there have been objections to forgiving student debt. If you violate principles like that, what will happen next? And is forgiving debt even fair for everyone? So grace is often seen as this kind of high-minded, flighty, unwise, and weak approach. So what does this parable have to say about grace? If you're more cold and calculating and not ready to embrace grace because it's the loving thing to do, then know this: grace is smart. Grace is cunning. It's shrewd. Grace gives room in imperfect situations for log jams to be freed up, to move beyond the past into the future, to find a way forward. History is often described like a pendulum. You could make the argument that we've been living in a time when principle comes first. In fact, all of us have deeply held principles, and we get a lot of encouragement these days to stand on our principles above all else. And to be sure, there's encouragement in faith for that. Sometimes we're called to do the right thing, even in the face of adversity, and I've actually talked about that recently. But that seems to be the overwhelming, nearly exclusive image of faithfulness of late. Stand true to principle above all else, no matter what. Let the chips fall where they may. But today's parable may be partly a counterpoint, just so we don't become absolutist about being absolute. Sometimes it's wise to cut a deal, to make a compromise, to bring an impassable situation to an end. It allows things to flow again. to move on. There's grace in that. For those of us who think the only faithful response is to be undying in commitment to principle, Jesus invites us to see a more complex picture. Principle is often hardened. It can become impersonal and implausible. Compromise sounds like a bad word, but its original meaning is mutual promise. There's a relational dimension to it. Is compromise always the best solution? Maybe not, but the parable of the shrewd or dishonest manager suggests we shouldn't reject it so reflexively. It's not unfaithful, selling out, weak and unwise. It's the opposite in some cases. If the idea that compromise may be faithful is shocking to you, then maybe this parable of Jesus has accomplished its purpose. But there are a couple of other surprising elements we get from this story that I also want to cover. The first has to do with the picture of God that we carry around with us. I continue to be surprised by how many people picture God as humorless and unforgiving. This parable shows a little different picture, I think. We can't assume that it's a perfect allegory with each person in the story representing someone, but at least in certain respects, the rich man or employer is eventually set up as a kind of stand-in for God, represents at least some of the values of God. And to be fair, the parable sets us up to expect that this employer is tough based on the fact that he's firing his manager over mismanagement. Not maybe unfair necessarily if the manager has been squandering his property, but he holds him accountable. But this initial expectation of the man being a typical cold-hearted employer turns out to be a huge feint, because when we find out that the manager cuts deals with the debtors for his own benefit, we're waiting for the employer to be furious. If he was upset before, he's really going to come down hard this time. You just lost me money for personal gain? You think I'm going to let you get away with that, buddy? Well, actually, yes. And I'm not only going to let you get away with it, but I'm actually going to praise you for it. A wise person apparently appreciates wisdom. He sees the wisdom of grace and embraces it. God delights in clever wisdom when it's done for the right purpose, or at least when it results in good, regardless of the intentions. He says, "For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes." So we're back to where we started, that shocking statement. Is this blanket permission for dishonest financial practices and cheating? Not at all, let's be clear. And that's the final element I wanted to talk about. This parable speaks to how we handle our money, or as the parable calls it, wealth. And I said earlier when talking about grace that it's often seen as high-minded, flighty, unwise, weak, but also unfair. Why is it okay to forgive someone for a debt in the case of the parable, or anything else for that matter? We can think about the debt in the parable more in the figurative sense, as a metaphor for any kind of debts. We may be indebted to a person relationally for the kinds of things they've done for us. Debts could also be seen here as our spiritual debts, sin, what we've done and left undone. But I also want us to think of debts more plainly for a moment. Jesus does talk about money quite a bit, and it's important to know some background on the economic system and practices of the time where Jesus told this parable. Under Roman rule, rich landlords and rulers were loan sharks, in the words of New Testament scholar Barbara Rossing. They used excessive interest rates to accumulate more land and to take away the family land of peasants, which was in direct violation of biblical teaching, actually. A rich person or lord, along with his steward or debt collector, would have typically exploited desperate peasants. Another scholar, William Herzog, says during this period that wealthy landlords created ways to charge interest under other guises, often hiding interest by rolling it into the principal. The hidden interest rates appear to have been about 25% for money and 50% for goods. Managers may have extracted their own cut of the profits on top of the 50% layer for the landlord and the additional payment for Rome. So that is the horrible financial reality for many common people in that world, seen through this parable as Jesus was telling it for the first time. Everyone hearing him in person would have immediately envisioned the owner and his manager in that way, not in favorable ways. Until, of course, they, like us, were surprised by the character and actions of both the owner and the manager. In Luke's gospel, Jesus invokes the biblical concept of Jubilee, which was a time when debts would be forgiven across the board. Economic restitution is part of the joy of the Magnificat right at the start of the gospel. We also see this same concern and reality at work in the story of Zacchaeus the tax collector, when we learn that he too had been extorting higher than needed taxes from people, and he chooses to restore what he had defrauded those people and then some. This parable certainly applies to some of those more figurative examples of debt, but we shouldn't miss some of the direct reference to money and wealth in this case as well. People are still exploited financially today through things like payday loans and other kinds that saddle people with excessive debt. There is a well-documented history of wealthy nations intentionally setting up developing nations with insurmountable debt, both to reap ongoing interest payments from them, but also to give wealthy nations leverage and additional power over them. In fact, the Lutheran World Federation has called oppressive debt terms imposed on Latin American countries and others around the world in the past as illegitimate debt, and compares it to a form of violence because of its crushing effects on people's futures. And so financial exploitation and the greed that destroys other people's lives for personal benefit helps us understand the final statement of Jesus in this parable. You cannot serve God and wealth. Amassing more and more wealth inevitably comes from somewhere. The question is where? Jesus calls us to a different future, one in which those without influence catch a break. They wake up to less debt, less burden, a more hopeful future, a future obviously with hope for financial independence. But this parable and the wisdom of grace also paints a future in which impassable disagreements between people are resolved and grace is extended to one another in the form of mutual promises, even among those who have previously opposed each other. A future in which life can take root again in the absence of conflict, but also in the absence of exploitation and unjust practices. A future in which people don't see God as harsh and punitive, but as one who delights in wisdom, in good judgment, and in those who work for abundant life for everyone, including the poor and indebted. Can you picture it? Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.